So what are some of those must-have upgrades or components from the board gaming perspective? That's what we're going to explore and collaborate on in this vlog. So certainly there's this idea, whatever type of board gaming narrative that you like, and if you've been following my channel for some time, you know dungeon crawlers. I can't help myself. RPG type games. I can't help myself. I have a lot of titles. I feel like I'm good. Then something new comes out. I mean, you know how it is. But this idea of a board game where you're stepping into the narrative, you're stepping outside of space and time, and you're immersing yourself in this world. Gameplay and narrative, absolutely important. But components are a big part of that, whether it's miniatures, artwork, tokens, acrylic tokens, plastic tokens, custom dice. How they appear, of course, depends on taste, but they help to pull you into the immersion. And I find myself, when I'm playing board games with a group or solo, being pulled into that narrative. And we want to maintain that narrative. Now, in terms of components that make things easier to play, not only does that lead to a more enjoyable experience, but I find it contributes to the narrative. It helps to pull you in. It helps to have that feedback in play. So a couple of things that I have that I like to use and given the optimal situation. The first is I call it a table topper. I do have a dedicated gaming table in the Fritz cave, but I don't always find myself playing there depending on what's going on, or like recently playing a massive historical battle campaign going on for a couple of weeks. That's taking up the whole table space. We're not moving it, but I wanted to play some solo, get in some solo board gaming. So in exploring that perspective, this idea of a table topper, it's a felt covered board with an edge. So in theory, the dice don't spill off it. And it's large enough that it can accommodate most games with a decent spread. And normally I put this on top of the gaming table. But it's portable because this way I can move it everywhere or anywhere. And I like this idea because sometimes I'll go into the den and just kind of set up an end table and sit there in my recliner and maybe watch some TV and play a game. When I have to move it from place to place, or more importantly, park it or move it away from the cats if it's outside of the Fritz cave, then I can put it on top of a bookshelf, or I can move it. So I find having some sort of table topper really, really helps, whether it's covered in felt or some other material, or maybe it's like a nicely polished wood. But something as simple as that really helps playing board games. The other aspect on top of that, or in addition to that, player mats. This is something that I learned a little bit later on. Pathfinder the Adventure card game. Rise of the Rune Lords, one of my favorite games. It's a card-based RPG type game, and you have a lot of decks that you build to explore. You have a lot of item decks and monster decks. I mean, it's a pretty extensive card game. I would say more so than Lord of the Rings, the living card game, but that's another great example. I find having a neoprene mat or some sort of mouse pad mat to play on is a huge, huge help. Just in manipulating the cards, placing the cards, shuffling the cards. They're mostly sleeved, but sleeved or not sleeved, Lord of the Rings is sleeved. Pathfinder the Adventure card game is not sleeved. Having something like that helps with or without this table topper idea. Dice towers, dice cups, dice trays. Depends on the game. Certainly, I love dice-based games, not only for the random of it, but the feedback, the biomechanical feedback of picking up the dice, thinking, gods, I need this, rolling those dice, seeing how they play out, and if it's multiple dice, how they turn, and then adding it up and realizing, yes, I made it, or no, I did not make it. Depending on the game, it will be either just roll the dice on the table, or I do like to have kind of like a little dice tray area that I can roll it, and put it out, especially if I'm playing solo or on a smaller area where I'm the one that primarily needs to see the dice rolls, but I don't want them to go all over the place. Dice towers are fun. They are. And in certain situations, I really like using a dice tower. I find using a dice tower if I'm playing games that have multiple builds of dice and different type of dice. Okay, examples. Conan, the board game. I love it. You start out with these base dice. And depending on actions, depending on what you want to spend for points, you can add more dice. But it doesn't get too out of control. Pathfinder the Adventure card game, you have your base dice, but then you can add on abilities to double the dice. You can add on magical effects, frost, flame. That'll add more dice. You can add on sneak attack. That adds dice. Essentially, I know I'm committing heresy, Pathfinder equating with Dungeons and Dragons, but think about D&D where your character, depending on their level and abilities, you can have a big dice pool. I find something like that works really well with a dice tower. It's kind of fun to take that shovel of dice and just drop it in and have it come out and have all the dice there to add up. So sometimes dice tower really depends on the game, but I like that little area for the dice. Card holders, organizers, things like that. Yes, if possible. I mean, there are certain games that if you have such a thing, it really transforms the game. I mean, perfect example, Talisman. You know I love Talisman. All expansions in play, big box, small box, everything needs to be in play. That's a lot of cards. Having a home base works. Having something to organize all the cards and stack them up, absolutely. Gloomhaven, I love Gloomy. I don't want to say you need, but I played a lot of Gloomy without an organizer. And forget about just setup and takedown time. A lot of my Gloomhaven play was solo, so I would set it up and then leave it up for a couple of weeks and play. So it's not really fair to say the investment of time in terms of that setup. But I do find just playing the game, all the components and the tiles and having everything, an organizer is great. So I do consider that, depending on the system and depending on the game, almost mandatory, some solution. Now, it could be a broken token thing. It could be something you've put together. It could be a ton of Ziploc bags. It could be Plano boxes. I mean, that's something for another time. But certainly in exploring that, I consider that an essential component. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to you guys. That perspective, those components, those pieces, those additions that really are almost auto-include or go a long way to really helping the enjoyment of playing a board game.